Hey everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Payoff Pitch. I'm Chris Steele. I'm joined by James Vecchio, and this week we're going to be talking a little bit about the White Sox, and we're also going to talk about three facts that fantasy baseball just isn't ready for. So, just to kind of start off this week, James, it seems like the White Sox are in a prime position to be a team that contends in the American League this year. And already they're going the way of the White Sox and having silly injuries. Eloy Jimenez injures himself. It's the third time he's fought the wall and the wall is won. And so just what can we expect from this White Sox team that always seems like when they're poised to do something special, finds a way to blow it?
I think this year is the year where they need to take that step forward. They need to go to the playoffs and they need to win a series at the very least. And not only do I think they need to do that, I think they will do that. As we all kind of know now, baseball's not 162 and then the best two teams or four teams make the playoffs and you play these deep series. It's all about being healthy at the right time and getting hot at the right time. And these White Sox are perfectly capable of making the playoffs and then being hot and going on a huge streak. And well, yeah, Eloy fought that wall and lost once again. He's also the kind of player who's going to be there in September. It's not like he's tore his ACL and he's done for the season or anything like that. He might be out a few games to start the season, but he should be fine. And this team should be fine. They're the favorite in the AL Central. They're the hot, sexy new team with all the young guys who are finally here to take that leap forward, and I really actually think they will. I think they'll put their money where the mouth is, so to speak.
Well, and I think Eloy is an interesting case because I think he gets overlooked for how talented he can be, because a lot of the attention went to Tatis, it went to Vlad Guerrero. Those were the hot names, but Eloy had that same kind of prospect grade and was right there in that same class. If it was like a different like timing, I think we'd be looking at him in an even greater way and expecting a lot more from him. But he's kind of flown under the radar to a degree.
I agree completely. He came up as a 22-year-old and he did well for a 22-year-old. He hit 30 homers, which is amazing. But he also did it in 2019 when half the league hit 30 homers. So it's not as amazing as it might be when you just look at the stats and don't think about the league overall. He's put up two OPS plus 115 years. He's been very good. Obviously, we had the small sample size last year with everyone, but he has flown under the radar because he's not flashy like Tatis. He can't flash the weather. He's not going to do that ever. But he's going to hit and he's going to rake. And if he increases that walk rate just a tiny bit, which he very well might do this year with a lineup that's better than it's ever been, he could be something really special. And even if he doesn't, he could just be a very good few-time All-Star player who, yeah, maybe he doesn't meet those lofty prospect expectations, but he could have a career parallel to Jay Bruce, which feels like he was a
Yeah.
disappointment, but he wasn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay Bruce helped win a lot of people, a lot of leagues over the years.
Exactly. He's the kind of player who's going to probably get that stench of, oh, well, he's never won an MVP. He's not going to be a clear-cut first-round pick, top two overall outfielders. And people are going to feel like he's a disappointment, and they're not going to understand that he's not that. You just need to set your expectations right and understand that his ceiling isn't Mike Trout, but whose ceiling really is.
Yeah. Well, another guy who is that young and already has a ton of major league experience is Yoan Moncada. Yoan Moncada was a fringe MVP candidate in 2019, fell off a little bit last year. Do you just kind of throw that out and assume that with more baseball to be played this year, he's going to return to that same kind of player?
With all of the small sample size seasons of last year, it's when they do well, you go, oh, they're going to parlay that forward. When they do poorly, you're going to go, it's a wash. It wasn't anything that
Right.
significant. But when you look at a guy like Moncada, he had COVID-19, and he's been open and honest in saying that it really did affect him. He was highly fatigued, and, he performed poorly. But he's also the kind of guy who actually put it together in 2019. He was very legit. He's in his prime as a 26-year-old, and he's going to be great. And unlike previous years, like in 2019, he doesn't have to carry this offense. He doesn't need to be the best bat out there. And I think that burden being lifted off of his shoulders is going to carry him a lot further. Also, when he's hitting in between Jose Abreu and Eloy Jimenez, he's going to see some pitches. He hasn't had that option before. Abreu's the best he's ever been, and Eloy, in theory, is the best he's ever been. So he's going to get his chance, and I think he's going to perform. He might not get back to his 2019 numbers, but he's going to be a very good third base option.
And Abreu is a player that I've always kind of been wary of because of his age. It feels like he's been around a long time. He came into the league, he was a little bit older. There's always those kind of ideas that maybe he's even older than his age says that he is. But Abreu just continues to put up amazing numbers. Just last year was incredible. Are you buying him this year, or are you selling him at a high point?
I'm buying him to put up his 2018 numbers, which are very good, but they're not his MVP numbers. And I don't think anybody out there is buying him as an MVP candidate yet again. No one's speaking of him as the, new Miguel Cabrera or anything like that. He's older. He had a career season, and he's going to put up numbers until he stops putting up numbers. But people who have high contact rates and solid power because of their high contact rates, they don't just fall off the table. They have slow, steady declines. And I don't expect Abreu to keep up these numbers for the next 5 years, but I don't expect him to morph into a fringe candidate or anything like that. He's a top 12 first baseman, probably top 10, potentially top 5, and he should be treated as such.
Well, and I think you got to really give it to the White Sox GM, Rick Hahn, for continuing to not only believe in the younger guys that they get on their roster, but to pay those younger guys and to not play the arbitration game too. You're seeing another case of that this year with Andrew Vaughn being called up. And that could be somebody that, if people don't know, Andrew Vaughn could be an under the radar guy who could help you win a league this year. He may end up only being like a DH only, but this is a guy who's won the Golden Spikes twice. He's a legit hitter. So, I mean, the White Sox are kind of doing it right and making sure that the players they do have on their roster that are younger and talented are feeling appreciated.
I am all about Andrew Vaughn.
Right, me too.
I think he's in a dynasty league, a top 10 asset at first base today. I think he is an absolute stud. He's walking into a situation that is absolutely perfect for him. He's going to be hitting low in the order behind elite hitters, and he's going to be just asked to hit, and that's all he needs to do, and it's all he's ever done. And I think he is going to win so many leagues, especially every league that's been drafted, because you can go and add him, you can go trade him, and you can get him for cheap, and he is going to be a fantasy star this season, and I think he's going to be a fantasy star for the next decade. He is a stud. He's a Freddie Freeman-esque player who you can go get on your waiver wire in half leagues today, and you should go get him.
Yeah, and especially the way Freddie Freeman handled the bat last year, that's saying something. So
it's high praise.
Right, absolutely. Well, and it's a case with Andrew Vaughn where people kind of did want to see him a little bit last year, and then in that like abbreviated spring training that we had in the run up to the league, he looked outmatched even against, just spring training pitching. This year it's completely different. He looks like he's ready. And I think I don't know what he's done to make himself so ready when he's only faced single A baseball up until this point. It shows you what kind of hitter that he is, that he just is here and he's arrived.
I mean, it's hard to put huge stock into spring training numbers because you don't know exactly what the players' objectives are when they're at the plate. In the majors during the regular season, their objective is to get on base, to hit for power, do whatever it is they do best, and they're not working on things in game. In spring training, it's not so much the same. If you remember Shohei Ohtani, when he first came up and he was in the majors, he looked overmatched as a hitter in his first spring training. He hit like 130, couldn't walk, looked like absolute trash. And there was talk of saying he shouldn't be a hitter to begin with and just be a pitcher. And then look what he did. He immediately mashed, was immediately a star, and he was probably just working on something. I don't know what it was. I don't have that insight, but I always take spring training numbers with a grain of salt. They're super small sample size. You don't know exactly what type of pitchers they were facing, except when you dive right in, and it can go either way. With a guy like Vaughn, he's always been a hitter. He's always been projected to be a hitter, and he's always hit. And I don't see any reason to sell him short, especially when he's getting called up to be the fifth or sixth piece on an offense. That's when he's going to get his pitches, and that's when he's going to hit, because he's going to have to get those pitches because there's going to be runners on base. It's a gold mine for fantasy, and at his price, you're a fool to not go grab him.
What's your kind of thoughts on Tim Anderson? Because there's always been that knock on him that he doesn't walk enough to be an elite hitter. Over the last couple of years, he's put up great numbers and a great average. Do you think you can continue to do that when you don't take walks?
Yes and no. There's always the outlier. The most obvious one that comes to mind is Rod Carew, who hardly ever walked, but always hit 330. Ichiro, despite being as elite as he was, he really never walked. Not to say Tim Anderson's in either of those two's category, but he can definitely put up the fantasy numbers you need in a standard 5x5 without those walks. He's the type of player that you want to sell because you don't see those walks. But also, when he's hitting at the top of this lineup against this AL Central all season, I don't see why you should be selling him. He's a very, very nice all-around player who, yeah, you're not buying him to hit 340, but who are you buying to hit 340?
Well, one guy who has a legitimate shot at potentially doing that on the White Sox is Nick Madrigal. And you kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier about them deadening the ball. Is that going to benefit somebody like Nick Madrigal, who's going to be lucky to hit maybe double digits in home runs, but has a legitimate shot to hit around 340?
While I love all of the White Sox we've mentioned so far, I'm tepid on Nick Madrigal. I think he can hit for average. He's always going to do that. He's never going to hit for power. And in the fantasy game, you need some power. You can't be a black hole there. And he's not going to have that. He's not going to drive in runs. He's going to get his runs. But if he's at the bottom of that lineup, if he doesn't hit 340, he's not doing much for you. He's someone I'm in the wait and see process with. I don't believe in him like others believe in him. Yeah, he hit 340 last year. Of course, it's small sample size, so I can go and point out the obvious and say, oh, he's not going to do that over the full course of a season. But when it comes to hitting for average, that's the easiest thing to say you're not going to do because you have to keep up that rate all season. And he's just someone who, while I like him, I think at his ADP right now, he's going a little too high. He's hitting at the bottom of the order. He's not going to have power, which means he's not going to drive in that many runs. And he's just good. He's not great. And hopefully he proves me wrong, but I'm not all in on him yet.
He's fast, but he doesn't probably have enough value in that speed to be a premier base stealer either. So that's where he's kind of finding himself in that same position where you're saying good, not great, especially considering where he is in that lineup too.
Exactly. He's going to get you runs in theory when they flip the lineup over, but they're not going to ask him to run because the top of the lineup's going to be up. So you're not going to get your steals. You're not going to get your power. You're likely not going to get your RBIs. So, yeah, you might have a net win in runs and an average, but you could go get a Luis Ariz for a much cheaper price tag with multi-position eligibility who's going to do the exact same thing. He's too much of a elite prospect who has the sexiness label on top of him when his numbers aren't going to meet that expectation. It's not to say I think he's a bad baseball player by any means, but from the fantasy perspective, he's someone whose ADP makes me a little bit iffy on drafting.
And like you're saying, not a guy who's going to hit for power. The other problem is that he's hitting for average, but he's not barreling the baseball at all, which means he's not hitting in those power alleys or anything like that. I think he hit around like what we're saying, around like 340 last year, and he had one barrel maybe. And so that just shows you that he's a guy who just finds ways to get on base. but he's not going to be one of those guys who's driving in a bunch of people, just like he said. But he's also not going to be getting those like OBP numbers that you need to get like those doubles or even triples that he potentially has the possibility of getting with his speed.
Exactly. He's got a lot more real life value to the White Sox than he does fantasy value. He's got the ties to this lineup, which I've already stated I like a lot. But when you think about a guy who doesn't slug, plays solid defense, has good but not great speed, and likely won't steal, you're not talking about a fantasy asset. You're talking about a real life asset. You're talking about a Colton Wong who's got a little bit less defense and is hitting singles instead of walking. That's nice, but in my fantasy lineup, that's not winning me anything.
Mm-hmm. And at catcher, Yasmani Grandal, I don't think ever really gets his due there either. He's an elite fantasy catcher. A lot of people just kind of remember him falling on his face a few years ago in the playoffs. But this is a guy who's consistently putting up good numbers at a position where it's hard to find somebody who can be consistent.
Exactly. It's always tough to value catchers because in fantasy, with the amount that they play relative to all the other positions, they seem to have such a bad cost compared to who else you can pick at ADPs. My instinct is almost always to just wait on catcher, try and find whoever is the hot guy during the season and just play that hot hand. But if you're looking for consistency, if you're looking to not play the waiver wire all year, if you're looking to just plug in a guy and sit there and watch him do well, Grandal is your man. He's going to hit. He's going to get his days off. He'll play 60% of the time, and he's going to have a good home run rate. He's going to get his RBIs. He'll have an acceptable average, and he won't steal. Well, you're talking about an elite catcher when you say those things. You're not talking about elite at any other position, but at catcher, those play, and those play really well. And that's exactly what he is. He's a boring veteran who doesn't have the sexy upside, who isn't the kind of guy who you're thinking, oh, he could go win me a fantasy championship, but he's the kind of guy who doesn't lose you one either.
Mm-hmm. He's also a guy that you could play him at catcher 60% of the time if you're the White Sox, and you could also sneak him in at DH every once in a while too, which adds to his value because he's still going to get those at bats.
Exactly. If you want to give Vaughn a spell, if you want to give Abreu a spell, he can get those at bats. But also, if Vaughn and Abreu are the players I think they're going to be, right, you're not going to want to give them a spell.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one guy that caught my eye, but I'm in the camp of he's completely done, is Jonathan Lukroy. He's going to end up being the backup catcher on this team, and maybe even the third string catcher on this team. People are going to go off of name recognition when it comes to him, but I think this is a case of he's been done for a while.
I agree completely. I think that the White Sox plan to start the season is to run three catchers with him and Zach Collins backing up Grandal. And I think their overall plan is to use him more as a coach than as a player, and to try and get him to teach Zach Collins how to be an acceptable backup. And when the time comes for Adam Engel to get activated off the DL or whatever it may be, I don't think Lukroy is a White Sox this full season. He's very much in the category of being a guy who can give you innings, but you don't want to throw him out there. He's too old, too slow, and his bat doesn't do enough to have any kind of upside that a team wants. So, yeah, exactly. He's going to have that name recognition that people might go and try and buy late in a draft, and it's going to be a poor buy because that name recognition isn't something you should be buying in 2021.
Lucas Giolito has put together back-to-back seasons now where he looks like one of the best pitchers in baseball. Is there anything holding him back at this point? He had such a rough start to his career, especially in Washington in those first couple of years with the White Sox. At one point, he was talking about how he was tired of losing, but he had an ERA of 6. And so since then, he's been electric. Is there anything that makes you wary of taking him, or is he as elite as you can get at this point?
I think he's as elite as you can get. He's the type of player who's going to have that, he was really bad at the start of his career stench for too long. I don't know how long it's going to be, but whenever that does go away, it's going to go away too late. He's probably the best arm in the AL Central, and the AL Central isn't exactly ripe with bats. Cleveland, my home team, can't hit anything. The Tigers, they can't hit anything even worse than Cleveland. And Kansas City, while they're attempting to win this year, they very well might sell, and they very well might not hit either. That's 3/5 of the entire division, and he doesn't play the White Sox. He's going to be able to put up numbers by virtue of playing those guys more often than not. And when you're looking at American League starters, that's the division I want to attack. I'm not looking to add people in the West. I'm not looking to add people in the East. I want to snag somebody in the Central. And Giolito's the best pitcher in the division that's not named Shane Bieber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Well, and just for a moment, we want to thank our sponsors for tonight, Yard Barbers. Hate spending those long summer days doing yard work? We have your solution, Yard Barbers LLC. Yard Barbers LLC is a local full-service lawn care company looking to provide the Quad Cities with quality and affordable outdoor services. Don't wait and fall to the back of the line. Contact Yard Barbers right now for a free yard evaluation and estimate. Find Yard Barbers on Facebook at Yard Barbers LLC or send them an email at yardbarbersqc@gmail.com. And one guy on the pitching staff that gets a lot of love that I'm not a big fan of, James, is Dallas Keuchel. And Dallas Keuchel has really kind of vaulted himself back in the conversation of one of those pitchers that's knocking on the door of being elite. But for me, he's too much of a ground ball guy to ever put up the numbers that you need to see to give him that kind of title. What's your take on Dallas Keuchel, especially now that he's nearing, I think, age 33?
I mean, he's a guy who I think won a Cy Young. He's a guy who has that name brand recognition. But like you said, he's 33. He put up an ERA under 2 last year, so he's got a lot of sexiness when you just glance at the stats.
Yeah.
But he's exactly what you said. He's a ground ball pitcher. He's a great in real life pitcher in terms of eating innings and not giving you blow up starts, getting those, 6, 7+ innings out in every single start. But in fantasy, you have innings caps, or you have guys who you want to get that K rate up because you got K rate stats, and Keuchel hurts you there. And it's weird to say that because he pitches so much, it's not necessarily a good thing in fantasy, but it's true. He's a nice starter. He's worthy of speculating on because, the White Sox are going to win some games. He's going to go deep into games. He should get some wins. But not every league uses wins, and his quality starts might be not the greatest because he might be giving up 4 runs in the start. But at the same time, you look at the rest of the starting pitching in the AL and you go, well, Keuchel's in the top half. He's very much a guy who is good enough to be on fantasy rosters, but not good enough to want to buy with confidence.
Well, and another aging pitcher on the White Sox is Lance Lynn. It's somebody that I think is going to get drafted really high this year. If you look at his ERA, it was 3.32 last year, but his FIP was 4.19. And there's reasons to think that going from a team that never really mattered in the Texas Rangers to a more prominent role here with the White Sox could be detrimental to him.
I definitely think Lance Lynn's in the same category as Dallas Keuchel in that he's going to eat those innings, which is what the White Sox want. He's not going to blow up, but he's not going to be overwhelming, and he's not going to be that kind of guy who's getting you all those ratio numbers you want. The difference between Lynn and Keuchel is Lynn's going a lot higher in drafts, and I'm not entirely sure why. He's getting up there in age. He's going to be 34, and he's morphing into a guy who only throws his fastball. That's great. He's got a lot of different types of fastballs, but at the same time, he's 34. He doesn't strike that many guys out. He's on a team that just wants him to eat innings versus being the guy. So you're playing for wins. You're playing for not bad stats versus great stats. And that plays in fantasy, but that also isn't the kind of guy who I want to invest highly in. And I think at his ADP right now, he's getting drafted too high.
Well, and then after those 3 that we've kind of mentioned, Giolito, Keuchel, and Lynn, that's when this pitching staff really falls off, and it falls off hard. They're going with Dylan Cease, and they're believing that Carlos Rendon is going to be back this year at good. right up until he pitches and he's injured again. So it's just, you don't know what the rest of that rotation is going to look like for the White Sox. And I think that's the only downfall that they have outside of Tony La Russa being a manager.
Yeah, I mean, their bullpen's deep. Their lineup is extremely deep. And the only place they're not deep is at starting pitching. But if there's anything we know at the trade deadline, there will be starting pitchers. They might cost a pretty penny, but you can go grab one with ease. And yeah, if Carlos Rodon isn't very good or Dylan Cease doesn't step up, then very well they're going to have to go get somebody. But also at the same time, if you're going to run a 1-2-3 that has Lynn, that has Giolito, that has Keuchel, that's your playoff rotation, and you might not necessarily need to go get another guy. They very much might be thinking they're good enough to have their team carry themselves into the playoffs without having that deep starting pitching, and they might be right. And Rodon does have a chance to step up and not get hurt somehow and actually perform, because when he's been healthy, he's been all right. I don't think he's going to be healthy. I think he's going to do exactly what you said and get hurt and fall off or not just be that consistent. But I do think Dylan Cease is someone to keep your eye on. He's kind of reinvented himself this spring. He looks great. He has that exact same feel as Giolito in that he was bad, continued to be bad, but has that pedigree and might turn around. And when you watch him pitch, he looks exactly like Giolito. So there's a lot of feeling there that makes me optimistic that he can be a 4 and be totally fine there. I don't hate the bottom of this rotation that much from a pure baseball perspective, but from a fantasy perspective, Cease is a dart throw with that high variance who could become the next Giolito or could get optioned after 5 starts and being horrible and we don't see him again. It's kind of the story of baseball nowadays, and that the bottom of rotations just very rarely are good.
Yeah. The next piece in that rotation may be waiting in the wings with Michael Kopech. Considering that he took last year off, I don't know how much I would trust in Michael Kopech. And this is just like a judgment-based thing because he seems like he's a very bro-y kind of dude who kind of wants to do his own thing. And personality-wise, I didn't expect him to be like at the top of his game. But from what everybody said, he is really ready to roll and embracing this idea that he's going to be in the bullpen. And maybe if he continues to do everything right there, he's going to be that guy that they call on a couple weeks into the season to be part of the rotation.
I believe in him long term, but for the 2021 season, I don't think he's going to be starting. I think they're going to limit his innings. He's always been a pitcher whose innings have been very capped. He didn't pitch last year. And if he pitches 6 innings every 7 games, that's not starting because it's 7 games and 1 start, but that'll get him up to about 130 innings, and that's his career high. I think they're going to toy with his arm very carefully and just leave him in the bullpen, let him be elite, but not overextend him. And then next season's when you see him stretched out during spring training. Next season's when you see him start to become a star. But this year, I think he's a fool's gold option. He might give you some nice ratios, but he's not somebody I think you should invest in with any confidence in getting you any kind of good starting numbers.
It makes a ton of sense. Well, in Liam Hendricks, the White Sox invest in him. He was phenomenal last year. There's no reason to really think that he's going to be anything less than gold, especially with a team that's looking like they're going to win as much as this White Sox team is going to win this year.
Yeah, I mean, he looks like one of the most entrenched closers there are, which is kind of surprising given how deep this bullpen truly is. And I think he's the kind of guy that you can invest in with confidence. Probably in most drafts, you're going to see him go off very high, and you're going to have somebody in your draft chat go, "Oh, why are you taking a closer this high?" But it's not 2013. Getting a closer who gets saves on a good team is rare. Getting a closer who actually pitches the 9th all the time is rare. Investing in a guy like Hendricks is not a bad choice because he gets you your Ks, keeps your ratios low, and gets you your saves. I think he's definitely one of the least risky closers in all of baseball, and I think investing in him at his ADP is not a bad decision. He's going high to people who don't understand how baseball shifted the past 5 years, and I think he's someone who can win fantasy leagues.
Yeah, and just looking at this bullpen, you're right. There's really talented pitchers in this bullpen, but nobody that you look at and you're like, he could take that job from him.
Exactly. Aaron Bummer looks great, but he's also coming back off of injuries. Evan Marshall has quietly become an actual true bullpen piece. Back when he was with Cleveland, he was more just a guy. Garrett Crochet looks like he's going to be a star and is kind of in the Kopech, I guess, category of a future starter who's in the bullpen today. So it doesn't look like he'll transition to being a closer. Cody Hewer also looks excellent, but he doesn't have that same kind of limelight that Hendricks has. And while he, I think, is your best chance to snipe some saves, he's nowhere close to what Hendricks is. So while this bullpen is very good, they're not going to be people who are going to snipe saves from Hendricks early. And if he struggles and loses the job, well, then he struggles and loses the job. He's not going to lose the job by simply being great and just not getting the save opportunities. He's going to be a ninth inning guy because the rest of the bullpen's good enough to pitch the sixth, seventh, and eighth without moving Hendricks there.
Yeah, and Crochet is one guy who is in the top 100 prospects that people don't really care about because he's towards that bottom of the 100, and he's a reliever, so people aren't paying much attention to him. But if he can come in and just be solid, maybe he's somebody that down the road could be a closer someday.
Definitely. I think the White Sox probably have grand plans for moving him to the rotation. I would think that they see Kopech and Crochet as future guys to take over when the Lynn's and the Keuchels of the world are towards the back end of their career. And I think next year, both of them could be starters. I don't think they see them as forever bullpen pieces. So I think that, you could see a David Price out of Crochet in being a bullpen guy early and then becoming an elite starter. I think he's someone in dynasty leagues that I would want to have a lot of shares of because he's not going to have a high cost today, and he's not going to perform badly today. He's not going to eat too many innings today, but he's not going to be that star that you think he's going to be in the future. He's a good buy, and I think he's someone you should buy.
Absolutely. Well, and we were talking about things we want to highlight for three truths about fantasy baseball people aren't ready for. And that brings up the one White Sox we haven't really talked about too much, and that's Adam Eaton, who makes his return to the White Sox after an inauspicious first stint where he had to kind of go away because of a lot of problems that he caused in the locker room and just not being somebody they wanted around anymore. What do you kind of see from this next version of Adam with this White Sox team?
Well, he's a guy whose OPS has trended down 4 straight years, and last year kind of cratered. It was under 670. He only had 4 homers, which seems like it's not that bad in a small sample size, but it's also not very good when you're looking at corner outfield production. His OPS plus cratered. It was under 100 for the first time at 76. He's in his age 32 season. He's on an age curve that's not favorable for him, and he's a guy who seems to not have a good locker room presence. All of that adds up to me is him being just a guy and the type of guy who gets replaced when he doesn't produce. I understand they just reacquired him. I understand that he's a White Sox in theory who's going to sell tickets or whatever that is, but I don't think he's going to produce. I think he's going to be the hole in the lineup. And while he might not get replaced because the rest of that lineup is going to be that good, he's also someone to just forget about from a fantasy perspective. Mm-hmm. Yes, he may have been good in the past, but he was never an elite power hitter. And now that he's getting older and he doesn't have that speed and he doesn't have center field qualification or anything along those lines, he's just a guy. He's going to be there. He's going to be tied to an offense that makes him look good. He might get streaky for a week or two, but he's not someone to buy. If you're spending a late round pick on someone, spend it on someone with higher upside. He's very much just someone who's there. He's no longer a fantasy relevant player from a full season perspective.
And Adam Eaton, another guy, along with Eloy, who has fought the wall several times and come away worse for wear. So another injury risk because Adam Eaton has missed a lot of time during his career too.
Exactly. I tend to not feature injury risks as something to hedge against because all players have that injury risk. But if you're someone who does, Adam Eaton doesn't win you any points in that regard. He's going to be a negative factor there too. And he's just not that good anymore. It's okay. Players age, players decline, and he's one of them.
What do you kind of think of Eloy's glove? Because it feels like we've talked a lot about Vaughn and how talented he can be. He's going to be the DH this year, but Eloy is not great with his glove. Luis Robert is exceptional in center field, but there's only so much he can cover. Do you think eventually they're going to have to tell Eloy that he's going to have to DH?
I mean, I think eventually they might try and convert him to first when it comes time for Abreu to move on, or maybe Vaughn moves to first and Eloy goes to DH.
Mm-hmm.
But today, I don't think it really matters. He's playing left field. It's the second least important position defensively. Yeah. He has Luis Robert out there who's going to cover a lot of ground and make up for him about as good as any center fielder can do. So while it matters, it also doesn't matter. He's going to be fine. You're playing fantasy to get offensive stats and not defensive stats. And I don't think the White Sox are going to truly care. Yeah, he's going to morph into being a pure hitter eventually, and that's going to take him out of the outfield. But when that day comes, he might be 28 or 29. He might move to first. I don't think he'll ever become a pure DH. I think he'll be able to invent himself into being a totally adequate outfielder. You look at someone like Kyle Schwarber, who everyone thought was a pure DH at 24, and he became a completely adequate outfielder. Eventually, that'll happen or it won't, but either way it goes, I don't think it truly matters.
Well, and for fantasy's sake, has announced that we have a partnership with Monkey Knife Fights. It's a daily fantasy sports gaming website for the casual sports fan that is simple, fun, and easy to play. Users determine which superstars compete in the day's professional sporting events and will record more or less than the contested line provided. Monkey Knife Fights daily fantasy prop games play similar to the salary cap-based DFS games, but without the algorithms, lineups, and most importantly, the sharks. These are several contests to choose from, none of which require hours of research required on competing sites. Start with a simple 2-on-2 or go for the highest payout 100 times and higher by selecting the 8-on-8. More or less contests. Get started now with 100% instant match bonus of up to $50 with promo code FFSQC. And James, looking at this White Sox lineup, Luis Robert is one player that I find kind of hard to pin down because he started last season and he just shot out like a comet. He was incredible. And then he kind of just settled into being good after that. So is he the guy who's going to be the next superstar, or is he kind of a guy who's just going to be a very good player on a very good team?
I think he's going to settle probably somewhere between those two. He's going to show those flashes of being a superstar, but he'll probably more often than not just be very good on a very good team. Someone who he gives me memories of is Andrew Jones, a guy who didn't get on base at a high rate, but played elite defense and at times was one of the best hitters in the game. He never really put that together over 162, but he developed elite power, which I think Robert can. Not to say he definitely will, but I think he can. And I think he will be a very, very good player for a very, very long time. But I don't think he's going to morph into a top 10 fantasy asset year in and year out. He's going to be great. And he might be a top 10 asset overall just to invest in today in a dynasty league because of his age. But I don't think he's going to come close to that Mike Trout stratosphere for any single season. I think he's going to be good, and he's going to get you numbers, and you're going to like having him on your roster. But we need to temper our expectations with every top-end prospect. Not everyone becomes the next Juan Soto. He can become a very good player and be a person who is by no means a bust, but also never be the elite guy.
Right. Well, and with the season basically knocking on the door at this point, what are kind of some things that you're going to be looking for when this first week of the season rolls around? What are you most interested in seeing once games actually start to be played?
I mean, I'm definitely interested in to see which rookies start out hot. When I say rookies, I don't necessarily mean people who are truly have rookie status, but people who are young and don't have a lot of at bats or don't have a lot of innings. And in general, the ones who start hot are the ones who stay hot for longer. And you want to get those guys on your roster. If you're not playing in a dynasty, there's probably plenty of guys who could start off really hot and hold that for a few months, or maybe even it's just 4 weeks. But you can get serious advantage out of being able to cut your back end roster quickly. And those are the people I like to keep my eyes on. There's always somebody at the beginning of the year who you can hop on and get huge profit out of. And it's always hard to cut those guys you drafted at the back end of a draft who you were like, this is my sleeper. He's going to be good. And he has a slow first week. And I'm of the belief system that you have to cut those guys. If they start slow and you think they're going to break out, it's okay to let them go. You need to go and try and grab the guy who's going to be the next star, because if you don't get him, someone else will, and that's opportunity lost. And in general, that comes with youth. There's going to be some youth out there that none of us are predicting to be that elite, and they're going to show up and be elite, and we're all going to be surprised. Last year, there was Randy Arozarena. People thought he was going to be okay, but then he became a star, and everyone thinks he will be a star, including myself. And the next Arozarena that shows up on the waiver wire, you need to go get ASAP. And it doesn't matter who you cut, because the back end of your roster is designed to be cut.
I think last season was just kind of weird for baseball fans because it didn't feel like the season actually started until the playoffs rolled around. And by that time, people are like, who is Randy Arozarena? And so it's just one of those things that, because the year was so odd, it feels like there's a lot more abnormalities this year, especially with so many guys seemingly going to Japan or the KBO. It just feels like there's a lot of new faces that potentially could be unknowns this year.
That's extremely true, especially without the minor league season. There's no Gavin Lux this year, who was a high-end prospect who went and just raked out of his mind in the minors and moved himself up every prospect board by being that good. That guy existed last year. He just didn't play. So maybe we're seeing that guy in spring, and he's going to show up, and maybe his name's Andrew Vaughn. But there's definitely going to be some young players who come from out of nowhere and are there, and you're going to be taken off guard by it as a fantasy player, because last year they didn't do anything. They didn't play. They didn't perform. They were just over at complexes working on their game. You just don't have the stats to see with that. And I think that that's an area where you're going to be able to take advantage of in nearly every single league, to go and get those guys early and often. And I think that's what's going to be the winning move in nearly all leagues. The person who adds the right guy early on and keeps doing it and keeps that roster fluid and doesn't hold on to guys for too long. I think if there's ever a year to cut bait early, 2021 is that year.
And one guy, if we're getting into our truths that fantasy baseball isn't ready for, one guy that I was really high on coming into this year was Jake Cronenworth. I thought he was getting ready to be a guy at second base that you could probably put up extremely high in that kind of elite status, because it's kind of a void there at second base, and we're just looking for the next player who could be good. Right now, he's way down in the lineup because they have so much talent on that Padres team. And then they also go out and they get, I think it's Hae Song Kim from the KBO, who's already in the top 100 in the prospect list and is probably going to be on the bench somewhere. So if Kim plays, he's probably going to play at second base, and that's going to push Cronenworth to first base or the outfield. And then once he's shifting around, what's that going to do to his value? What's that going to do to his ability to be a consistent performer? There's a lot of unknowns there that I just don't like.
You hit the nail on the head by saying the word consistency. Cronenworth might perform this year, but he's going to be playing all over the diamond. In addition to bringing in Kim, they brought back Profar, which says
Yeah.
to me they don't believe in Cronenworth as the everyday guy. You don't bring Profar and Kim in if you think Cronenworth can be that guy. I think Cronenworth's their super sub. He'll play all over the diamond. He might put up numbers, but you have no idea if he's starting day to day. And that's not a kind of guy that you're going to invest in very highly on a fantasy team because you need to platoon him with somebody. And he's just iffy. And I think based on his season last year, I agree with you. He's going too high, and he's someone I'm tending to avoid.
So if you're looking at just trying to make the best of a situation and you do end up with Cronenworth on your team, do you feel like you have to roster those other guys as well? Or from a strategic standpoint, do you want to just get somebody else on your roster who has the potential to blow up? Do you want to do the handcuff, or do you want to do a guy who potentially could be a lottery ticket?
Well, to segue into my three truths that people don't know, I'd pair him up with a guy like Gavin Lux. I love Gavin Lux. I have no idea why his prospect shine has fallen off. He's tied to the best offense in baseball. He's likely going to start on it. He's shown elite offensive numbers at the highest levels in the minors, and he's getting drafted in the 220s, the 230s. I don't understand it at all. Second base is not deep at all. I think he has the upside to be the number one second baseman in all of fantasy, and he's getting drafted that low. So if you want to pair up Cronenworth with someone, take a Gavin Lux. Maybe he doesn't play every day. Maybe they're shifting people around. Once he goes to second, you got Edwin Rio at first. Maybe I'm wrong in that regard, but the combination of those two, you're going to get some innings. You're going to get a start pretty much every day. And Gavin Lux is going to be a stud. Maybe he's not a stud on day one, but he is going to be a stud, and he has all of the support around him to be one. And I have no clue why he's getting drafted so low at a position that's so not deep. Every other position has depth besides catcher and second base, and Gavin Lux has that kind of upside, and I'm just clueless as to why he's not being treated with more respect.
I think it was because people were just so ready for him last year. There were all those projections. He was going to be the NL Rookie of the Year. And then when he didn't attain that, because it was a weird year, we've said that several times, but he struggled. He came out, and it was like Joe Adele, where there's these high aspirations for this player, but they tried to make the most of a bad situation. It didn't work out. They didn't live up to the expectation that everybody had for them. And because of that, we're just like, let's turn the page and we're on to the next thing.
I agree that that's probably why it's happening. And I've probably mentioned his name 2 or 3 times already, but the same thing may have happened with Mike Trout when Mike Trout got called up. Yeah, Mike Trout was 19 and Gavin Lux wasn't last year. He was a little bit older. He was, 22, but it's the same idea in that those sample sizes were very small. This is a player with insane pedigree, and he plays at a position that is scarce. He's not an outfielder. He's not someone who you can throw at the back of the bin because there's so many other options. I just really don't understand it, and I have Lux in nearly every league I'm in, and I feel like I'm going to reap the rewards, and I feel like this is a huge area for fantasy players to benefit in. He burned somebody last year, so they're not drafting him this year, and you can go ahead and draft him. He's still young. He's tied to an elite offense. Bye.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One guy that I really like, and he's finally going to get a shot to play a lot this year, it seems like, is Nate Lowe with the Texas Rangers. He was stuck in Tampa Bay, and Tampa Bay, either you're one of their guys or you're not. And for whatever reason, he never caught on there. They kept playing different guys at first base over him all the time. When he got his chances to come up, he didn't do terrible. But I just feel like, considering the fact that people who are scouts said that outside of like Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who got that 80 grade prospect for his hit tool, that Nate Lowe was the next best hitter they'd seen in the minor leagues in forever, makes it seem like he's a guy who's completely under the radar, who has the potential to shine.
Yeah, I think he does. And even if you don't believe that those prospect grades are going to necessarily trans over to the big leagues, he's going to get at bats. His only competition is Ronald Guzman, who we've seen has not performed at the big league level. And Texas is not in a position to say, oh, we're going to play our veterans today because we're going to win today. They're rebuilding. They're going to give him all the shots in the world to get his at bats and to play. And that's the type of person you want to invest in because you have that upside to be elite. You have that guaranteed playing time. And that's the kind of dart that you throw in a draft. Yeah, he's playing first. Yeah, there's a lot of options. Yeah, he might stink because he has no lineup protection or he might not be that good. But I don't understand why people want to move away from bad teams. I think that's where you find all of your value. Texas is going to stink, but they still are going to score runs. And Nate Lowe might be that guy who wins you a league because you invested in him when no one else wanted to.
And considering that you're a Cleveland fan, I wanted to pick your brain about one interesting playing position for the Indians this year. Bradley Zimmer is one of those guys that I just have always really liked because you don't find those like power speed combos too often. He reminds me a little bit of Drew Stubbs, and I think that if he really gets a chance to be the player that people think he can be, that could be something that could help people win leagues because it seems like there's always been something standing in his way.
You know, I've always seen him as a poor man's Byron Buxton.
Yeah.
He's got that kind of speed. He's got that kind of defensive ability, and he's got that kind of tie to a solid offense. And he's also hurt, and he also doesn't get on base. And those things don't really play necessarily when you get older and you're past 24, 25. But Cleveland's outfield is atrocious. It's probably the worst in the game. They have Eddie Rosario, but they decided to option down Machado, who was absolutely horrendous last year. And I think Bradley Zimmer's going to have all of the opportunity in the world to show that he's an actual good baseball player. And he either puts it together or he doesn't. And he might be the bad end of Byron Buxton, or he might be the good end of Byron Buxton. I think he's definitely someone who, like I've said before, you can throw a dart at and have the confidence to know that the variance is there where you can get a big return. I agree with you completely that he could become a star. I frankly don't think he will, but that's the type of person that you bet on in terms of late fantasy draft ADP and late value because I can be wrong, you can be wrong, but either way, you have that variance. You want to invest in that variance to try and get an elite guy late, and Bradley Zimmer is one of those guys who could do that.
And just keeping it with Cleveland, what do you think of Jordan Luplow? Because he's a player that it feels like it's very hard to figure out. Like in 2019, he had a weighted runs created plus of like 138. And then last year he was atrocious. Is he a player who's just going to be a fourth outfielder kind of guy, or does he have potential to break his way into a lineup?
When we first acquired him, I thought he was Jason Michaels. When he had that great 2019, I thought he was Jason Michaels. When he had that awful 2020, I thought he was Jason Michaels. I think he's Jason Michaels. He's going to get on base. He's going to not be that bad from a real on-field perspective. He's going to be worth keeping on your 25-man roster or 26-man roster. But fantasy-wise, he doesn't play unless you're in an OBP league. And if you're in that OBP league, he's a fringe guy. I don't like him at all from a fantasy perspective. He's a platoon guy. He's not going to play every day. He's very much just gross. I don't know how else to put it. He's not someone who you want to put on your fantasy roster because he doesn't have that high end upside like a Bradley Zimmer. He's not going to suddenly put together a season where he's elite. He might repeat his 2019. That's his best opportunity. And his 2019 was good. Not great, not fantasy winning, just good.
Mm-hmm. Well, Josh Naylor is a guy that I think I always give him the benefit of the doubt because I love power players, the guys who can absolutely mash. It seems like he could do that, but it's been so infrequent that he gets all that power behind the ball. Is there breakout potential there, or is he kind of the fool's gold?
I think it's both. The breakout potential is there, but it's probably fool's gold. His power is exactly like what you said. You can see it's there, but it doesn't show up. And of course, it might show up. He might become an elite power hitter and might be that outfielder that Cleveland's desperately needed for the past few years. But in all likelihood, it's just not going to get put together. He hasn't shown it at the major league level. He's pulled together enough at bats where you should see glimpses of that, and you haven't. And yes, he's young enough where he can still take some steps forward, but he's not the kind of guy who I want to bet on to do that. He doesn't have that speed. The Cleveland lineup's not going to give you those RBIs that you need if he does put together that power. And maybe the ball isn't as dead end as I believe it'll be, but power's been really easy to come by in fantasy. And if you're betting on somebody to be an elite power find, it's probably easier to just add somebody who shows up. You don't need to bet on that. When you bet on a guy like Bradley Zimmer, you're betting on that speed creation, which is a huge, huge add in fantasy because speed is rare. Power isn't. And Josh Naylor is kind of someone who I just think he can be somebody else's fool's gold, and I'll invest in somebody else in the late rounds.
Right. Kind of seems like when Jason Hayward first appeared on the Braves, and you look at him and you're like, with that body, there's no way he's not going to hit 30 home runs. And then he dribbles it out to the second baseman over and over again. And you're just maddened by the look of the player versus the result.
Exactly. Jason Hayward is a very solid comparison in what you see versus what you get.
And from a Cleveland perspective, is there any real excitement for the fact that you guys got Austin Hedges? Because this pitching staff has been so good with an elite framer and defender like Hedges. Does that make this team even more dangerous that you can have him on days that Perez is taking days off?
In theory, yeah. Pilecki, last year I think he was still around, or whoever our reserve catchers have been, they haven't been what Roberto Perez has been. And the fact that we decided to invest in Hedges and then keep him around and pay him arbitration money means that we believe that he can frame well. And in all honesty, I believe the front office knows what they're doing when it comes to pitch framing because we've had elite pitching for the past decade, it seems like.
Yeah.
And I really like the idea that instead of having a Perez framer back there 3 out of 5 days, we have one 5 out of 5 days when you add in Hedges. And I think that it bodes very well for values for Plesac, for value for Savale, value for Tristan Mckenzie, because I think that he can change a game. There's a reason why no teams really care about offensive production at catcher because they know how valuable that framing is. And if Hedges is as good as we all think he is and what he's shown in the past, he's a solid addition.
And you mentioned Tristan Mckenzie in there. He just caught fire last year, and I think he caught a lot of people off guard with how good he was. Is he going to continue to ascend, or is this somebody who's just going to be a back end of the pitcher?
I definitely think he's going to ascend. When I look at him pitch, I see Chris Sale. I see tall, lanky, and fast. And while you see Chris Sale and you think awesome, you also see Chris Sale and think arm injury. So right. You have both options with him. But I think he definitely has that top of the rotation, high-end potential. And I think in Cleveland, it's probably one of the best places in baseball to reach that potential. So I think he's the next Shane Bieber in the sense of he's going to take that step forward. He's going to become elite, and he's somebody I think you should invest in. And, like we were saying about the White Sox pitchers and Giolito, the AL Central isn't that good. Yeah, he's going to play the White Sox, but he's going to play 3 other offenses that are kind of duds. Minnesota gets on base, but they don't really score at the rate that they did back in 2019 when they were hitting all those homers. And I think McKenzie's someone you should invest in with confidence, especially going at his low-end IDP right now.
Well, and Cleveland's closer is one of those guys that I felt like I was aware of him, but not until I started seeing a lot of mock drafts and looking at other people's drafts as they're getting ready for the season to start. I just keep seeing his name over and over again, and that's why I feel like I should sit up and pay more attention to him.
Well, Karinchak is going to be, in theory, the closer. but I think that they're going to use him like they originally used Andrew Miller. He's going to be the best reliever on the club, and he's going to face the best portion of the lineup at the most pivotal time in the game.
Gotcha.
Sometimes that means he's the closer. Sometimes that means he pitches in the seventh. And while I think he's going to have value and his K9 is through the roof and his breaking pitches are outstanding, I don't think that he's as high end as he's been going in some drafts. I think you're paying for him as a closer in the draft, and I don't think he necessarily is going to perform as a closer. He's going to give you those ratios, but if you're looking for ratios, you can go get a Devin Williams or a Nick Anderson much later, and you might get the same amount of saves from those guys. I think he's a beautiful pitcher who I'm going to love watching every single game this season, but he's also the kind of guy who in fantasy I'm steering a little bit clear of because I feel like Cleveland's going to use him in a way that's not the most optimal from a fantasy perspective.
Yeah, and I think we're both on the Nick Anderson train, as he's probably one of the best relievers in baseball. He's just not a fantasy pitcher because of the way he gets utilized.
Yeah, on one hand, you could say he's not a fantasy pitcher. On the other hand, I put him on every one of my teams. I love those ratios. He's still going to get you those Ks that every other reliever gets. Yeah, he's not going to get you very many wins, but when he's not getting those saves, he will poach a few wins here and there, especially if he's pitching in high leverage situations. And I think those kind of relievers are constantly undervalued in fantasy leagues, specifically 5x5 leagues where you think you don't need them at all. If he pitches 5 innings in a week, gives up 1 run, strikes out 10, and has a whip of 0.7, that's a really good week. And yeah, you might be spending a full roster spot on him, but who cares? He holds value. And when you're playing, especially in a roto league where you have an innings cap, those innings definitely play. If you're playing in a head-to-head league and you have 2 or 3 Nick Andersons on your roster, you can just dominate those ratios every week. He's definitely someone who's sneaky good and I think is just constantly undervalued because there's not any single stat that you can point to and say he's an elite at on a week-to-week rate.
Diego Castillo, wow, I'm getting it all wrong. Diego is one of those pitchers as well on Tampa Bay that I think he's very similar. He's not as talented as it feels like Nick Anderson is, but he puts up creepy good numbers that just continue to make him look like more of a viable option in fantasy. Where are you at on that guy?
I like him a lot as well. He's another one of those relievers who I like to fill my roster out with. I tend to look just in general when it comes to drafting. I want to get my offensive players who play as close to 162 as possible, so I don't need guys on my bench to spell them, and then I fill out my pitching staff with ratio guys like Diego Castillo, someone who in some leagues is SP eligible, someone who's going to put up great numbers simply because he's in Tampa Bay, and someone who might become the full-time closer. You really don't know how they operate, and he's good. He's very good. He's not elite, but maybe he will be this year, and he's someone who I definitely have my eye on. He's not at Nick Anderson's level yet, but if he got there, I would not at all be surprised.
One thing I was talking about with a friend is we were trying to figure out who the best second baseman would be for fantasy. It's got to be Ozzie Albies, right?
Since we were on the topic of Tampa Bay, I love Brandon Wow. I understand that Ozzie Albies probably has that higher floor than Brandon Wow, but I'm drafting Brandon Wow in terms of his ADP as the best second base option. He might not finish the year as number 1. That might be Albies. That might be Gleyber Torres if he still qualifies in your league. Yeah. But I love Brandon Wow. I think at worst he's going to be the 3rd best second baseman, and I think that he, relative to the price of those other 2, is the guy you should invest in. Albies is great, especially from a fantasy perspective, because his weakness is on base percentage, and in most leagues that doesn't play. But I just love what they do in Tampa Bay. I don't really know exactly how they make every player reach their max potential, but they do. Wow had insane power numbers at second. He's also first base eligible and outfield eligible in some leagues. And I don't see why he's not the one you should be investing in if you're not going after a guy like Gavin Lux late in the draft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and it's going to be a fun fantasy season. We'll have actual games starting to be played by the next time we talk. So, looking forward to the season. Just as we wrap up, is there one player that you're most excited to see outside of Gavin Lux at this point?
I mean, when you put me on the spot like that, my initial answer is Manny Machado. I know that's kind of a surprising answer in the sense that we've all seen Manny Machado play. We know what he's capable of, and we know what he's probably going to do in San Diego. But on the other hand, the expectations that are in San Diego, the offense that's there with him, and just how good of a hitter he is, I want to see that all put together this year. I want to see him drive in Tatis Jr. 100 times this season, and I think it can happen. And I just want to watch that whole offense play. And while Tatis is the guy who has all of the swag and all of that youth and all of the thing the teens love, Machado's the guy I want to see play. That KG veteran who's just as good as Tatis, but a little bit quieter, despite still being Manny Machado.
Yeah. And there were a couple of good articles around the time that Machado and Harper were both hitting the free agent market, and it was, which one do you give all the money to? And it was kind of making the argument that Machado, for being as reserved as he is, may have cost him money because it didn't have the recognition of Bryce Harper, who was a flashpoint for people who either loved him or hated him.
Exactly. Machado kind of got that bad guy rap when him and Yordano Ventura were going at each other. He's also had that whole spiking of Jesus Aguilar. So he has that little bit of rap. But at the same time, on a field, when you're looking at who you want to devote money to, a third baseman is going to give you more defensive value. And when you're spending all that money, you can go get a cheap outfielder better than you can get a cheap third baseman. And it wasn't as cut and dry as some people might have thought. And I agree completely that Harper was the obvious choice in the media. But I love watching Manny Machado play. I might not always love his antics necessarily, but he can play baseball. And watching him take San Diego, in theory, to the highest point they've been at this millennia, I'm excited to watch it happen.
Yeah. For me, it might be Andrew Vaughn, just because I'm so excited to actually see it and be on the field and see him realize the hitter that everybody believes him to be. That's what I'm really excited for. Another one that I'm really excited about is Bo Bichette. Bo Bichette, I think, has kind of only brushed up against what he could potentially do. I think there's another level that he's going to ascend to this year.
Yeah, he's definitely one of those guys who's kind of, despite being really young, has fallen into that category of being very good and not great. And I think that could be a little bit of a fool's gold because he definitely could just suddenly have a power spike. He's got the body, he's got the talent to do it, and I think it's definitely possible, especially when you've improved Toronto's lineup as much as you have. And yeah, he's definitely one of many, many players I'm excited to watch play 162 this year.
Yeah. Well, and that'll wrap it up for the Payoff Pitch this week. Just as we wrap up, I want to let everybody know that For Fantasy's Sake has gear that you can wear. For Fantasy's Sake is the Quad City's first and only fantasy football show. And obviously we have adapted that into football, baseball, basketball, NASCAR, just about everything at this point. But if you're looking for Fantasy's Sake gear, go to our Twitter page, our Facebook page, For Fantasy's Sake, and you can find links to where you can get some awesome hats, t-shirts, beanies, just about anything you can think of is available there. You can also check out ViridianGlobal.com and find a link to the For Fantasy's Sake gear on there as well. So that's it this week. For James, I'm Chris. We just look forward to the first pitch of the season being thrown and real baseball being played next week. So join us then at 9 o'clock and keep an eye out for Points in the Paint, which will be on tomorrow at 8:30. All right. Everyone have a good night.
Night, everyone.